All righty. Well, as we're letting people in, and Melissa, I'll wait for you to tell me if everybody's in, but it looks like we have 2 council members on. And is that all that we're in the waiting room?
That is all so far, yes.
Perfect. All right. Perfect. Well, Zan and Janelle, thank you for joining us today. We will go ahead and get started with the request for application RFA work group. Just want to verify, Zan and Janelle, you can hear us and sound and everything's working.
I hear you.
Perfect. All right. Zan may still be hooking up, I'm not sure. All right. Well, Zan, when you have an opportunity, if you want to put it in chat that you can verify that you can hear us, and that we'll go ahead and get started. So appreciate both of you joining us today, as well as others that may listen to this in the future. But this is the request for application work group, or the Youth Development Council request for application work group. This is our first meeting for June 28th. And we are trying to implement a process so we can make sure to give as much discussion opportunity as needed. So for this small meeting, we're probably okay not changing that. But if you can and feel inclined, Zan and Janelle, to change it to that you're a YDO or a YDC member before your name would be very helpful if we have others join us throughout this meeting. Next slide, please.
Ready for that.
All right, and I should note that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted, just for the record. That is out there. My name is Paul Sell. I'm Associate Director here at Youth Development Oregon. We'll do some further introductions here in just a moment, but just to cover for what this work group is for today, the agenda will be do some introductions. We'll talk about expectations and structure of the work group, review our continuous improvement areas and RFA components, then move into the draft youth grants framework discussion, and lastly follow up with a future meeting outline discussion for this work. So a lot of this today will be setting the groundwork with some introductory discussions around our framework and topics for this work group. Next slide, please. And Sally, I believe I turn this over to you.
Yeah, so what we'd like to do is just some quick introductions. And so Janelle and Zan, I'll have you introduce yourselves first. We're hoping just for you to explain your name, your role, the organization you're with, and kind of your familiarity with the grants, but most importantly, what you hope to get out of and contribute to the conversation today. And so if you could just go ahead and introduce yourselves and then also drop it in the chat, that would be great. After you two do, then the YDO staff will introduce ourselves as well for the record. So Zan, if you could lead that, would be great.
Good afternoon, I'm Zan Ojiro, day job the Benton County Commissioner. I use she, her pronouns, and as a member of the Youth Development Council, I want to make sure that we are using best practices in our proposal processes so that everyone feels like they have had a fair shot at the funds. And we get the best possible proposals to serve our target populations.
That's awesome. Thank you, Zan. Janelle, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Janelle Theobald, and I'm on the Youth Development Council representing youth. I was a grant reviewer last year, and it was, a very valuable experience, I think. And I felt good, like, just knowing that I was contributing, making sure that, like, organizations got, like, the help they needed. And I think just I want more, like, behind the scenes knowledge of how, they came up with all those rubrics. And I just want to make sure that, every organization gets a fair chance. And so it's not like just larger organizations.
Great, thank you. I also probably should have led that I'm Sally Deck, and I'm a grant manager with YDO, and I'm going to pass it to another grant manager. And Jared, you're the next on the screen for me.
Good afternoon, everybody. Jared Shaw, grant manager and workforce analyst at YDO, and I will pass it to Molly.
Good afternoon, Molly Burns, grant manager and re-engagement analyst at YDO. I'll pass it to Abraham.
Hello, Abraham Aganya. I'm a grant manager operations analyst with YDO. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Bill.
Greetings, I'm Bill Hansel, grant manager and data lead. And I actually, I'm not sure who's left on the.
Bill, this is Melissa. I can take it from here. I can see everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Melissa Gallardo with Youth Development Oregon. My pronouns are she, her, hers, excuse me. And my role is executive support specialist. I will pass it to Cord.
Hey everybody, Cord Bucher, Deputy Director, Youth Development Oregon, he, him. Thanks for being here. Am I the last staff, and do we have any guests or other council members on the line?
Thanks. We haven't heard yet from Tanasia, and we don't have any guests online yet.
Got it. All right, then I will pass it to Tanasia because I also can't see everybody.
Thanks. Tanasia Bishop here, Youth Administrative. Sorry, Grants. Oh my gosh, do I know my title? Youth Grants Administrative Specialist. Thank you. And I'll pass it back to Sally.
Excellent, thank you. And if we have folks join as the conversation rolls, we'll pull them in and have them introduce themselves as well. Paul, I am going to pass it back to you to take it from here.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sally. If we want to go to the next slide. So part of what we wanted to do at this meeting and at this initial meeting, because these work group meetings will be posted and shared online, and so they'll kind of be a sequential process for us. So we wanted to take some time as we kick off this work group to talk about our structure and some of the expectations, as well as some agreements that we want to implement into this group. So the work group structure, and we'll cover this briefly in each sequential meeting, but is really a recurring touch point for our council and stakeholders to learn about and discuss the key 25-27 youth grants RFA components. We want this to be a non-binding dialogue to keep the RFA process moving forward within our timeline, as well as to simply increase the transparency about the process. So Zan and Janelle, appreciate you sharing the reasons why you want to be here. So hopefully this will be a part that we can do. And just for context, in the past, we have taken the RFA approval process to one of the full YDC meetings. And what we're trying to do with this work group is to break that down and chunk that down into key components along the way. Next slide. Just as a refresher, so at the last YDC meeting in June, on June 13th of this year, these were the goals that we laid out for this work group proposal, which is to review and discuss components. Just a couple notes on that. So that continuous improvement areas, which we'll talk about here briefly, also are going to include those opportunities for improvement from the external review that was done earlier in the year, as well as application and award limits and applicant eligibility. I apologize, I have a dog behind me if you guys can hear that, so I apologize for that sound. And then also we want to increase the input and discussion, as well as involve YDC members more into the conversation. So just sticking with those goals along the way. So if we move to the next slide. To help facilitate this conversation and discussion, we're trying to lay out some work group agreements that, again, we will revisit this before each of the work group meetings, but we want to keep the discussion and sharing to identified agenda topic item. There are a multitude of topics that we can talk about with RFA and probably spend hours on each one of those. So in interest of time and efficiency, we want to make sure that we focus our conversations to the agenda topic, to the identified topic. We want to use the continuous improvement areas, which we'll show in slide 8 here momentarily. It's also been shown previously in YDC meetings, as well as our YDO equity lens to guide our discussions. Depending on who's in the room, we don't know how many people will be able to join these work groups, and it's not dependent to be at one prior to the other one and such, but we want to give YDC members and invited participants priority during these discussions, and utilize the chat and reaction functions within that. So if you have something or you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. Melissa and Tanasia are monitoring behind the scenes to make sure that we're can address questions in the chat as well. Again, focused on a discussion, so a little less formal than some of the YDC meetings have to be. We want to remain muted until called upon. So Sally and I will be the facilitator of these meetings throughout. So please note that. And then we also ask that you turn on your camera while speaking, just so the group can do. Also, just a note on there, I recognize that some people may join on a cell phone or other options where that's not as easy. Just if you can note that for the record would be very helpful. And then stay committed to the allotted time. And so I think that'll be a lot of Sally's and my challenge to keep our conversation moving. So but we do have 90 minutes slotted for each of these meetings. If we don't use it, we don't feel like we have to, but we do want to keep and honor the time of folks joining us today. All right. I am going to pause there. I'm going to take a little detour from that. Is there any questions, Zan or Janelle, about those agreements or that information and structure? Perfect. All right. So this next slide, just to give us context, again, has been shared at the YDC meeting. I did note that I forgot to say that there's a YDC work group that's happening in the fall and winter, so that is added to this timeline from the council meeting. But the spring and summer is going to be our framework development and those large RFA topics and this work group. The fall and the winter is going to fall into the RFA materials creation, and I think you'll notice that as we look later in this meeting, the topics that we've outlined for this work group, and then you can see the other elements that are going to happen with an anticipated launch of their RFAs coming late winter of winter 2025. Excuse me for that typo. There should be a launch for those RFAs, and then the spring of 2025. That's when those evaluations and intent to awards begin in July on that. And the next slide is another slide that has been shown at the YDC meeting, is our continuous improvement area. So you'll notice that a lot of the materials and the topics will be designed around this. They kind of interweave the discussion, but the continuous improvement areas are around the application. So that's the RFA process and the questions and the what we call the scope of the RFA. So the intent of the RFA or the request for application. Evaluation is really, Janelle, I appreciated your comment about the rubric and how those are created. So that's where all of that material lives, the award. And so that is anything from award amounts to limits to regional awards. And so what does the award look like, and how do the fund and priorities go around that? And then lastly, post-award. And so the appeal process, that timeline, applicant follow-up, and applicant feedback is critical elements to that. And all of those will be interwoven into this meeting throughout the time. All right, so I think that's kind of the background information, Sally. I want to pause to make sure I didn't forget any of the background information we thought was important.
I think you covered it.
All right, sounds good. So we'll go to the next slide, and then we're going to pause after this slide to do a little discussion. This was introduced. I don't believe this was introduced in the June meeting, but our general youth grants framework. And so you can see on the right side of the screen, as grant managers, what we anticipate to do with the youth grants framework this go around is to have essentially 3 separate requests for applications, or the RFA. And those are those ones that are kind of in that gold color there in the center, were community investments. And that's a common RFA that we've had in the past. We have our re-engagement RFA. And then what we're planning to do is a new workforce development RFA. And just some context to that. Currently, and you can see on the left side, we have similar model of our grants, but you notice that it says Future Ready Oregon Grants, which is part of our workforce. And then we also have our Youth Workforce Readiness, which is in our community investment grants. And so what we plan to do is to lump both of those and create a new RFA separate from those two, well, that one initiative and the Future Ready RFA to be its standalone request for application process. And we're doing that for a couple reasons. One is to allow for the legislative process to happen while we are still creating the work around the RFA process. And so we will be working with the legislature, because we know that Future Ready grants are going to sunset at the end of this biennium. And so those funds, it's about a $7.5 million loss of funding that we anticipate for that. And so the legislative process will have to happen to see where that comes out at the end, if we get additional funds or if we have to use our remaining funds to cover that. And so we want some flexibility, but I want to recognize that timeline on it. So That's one of the main reasons why we're focused on pulling that workforce development outside of that, as well as some ideas around that the community investments is a pretty specific grant. A lot of it's focused on prevention and youth development services. We've had that youth workforce readiness involved in that CI, but by putting it into its own RFA, it can have its own reporting requirements and connections to it. And so that leads us into where that re-engagement collaborative a grant, which we have 5 grantees currently. We anticipate having similar to that in the future, be connected directly to the re-engagement and workforce RFAs and as a requirement of that work. So I'm going to pause there, and I know there's other Sally and Cord who have been part of this work. You can see on the left side, by the way, of our current initiatives within that. But Sally, anything to add to that framework?
I don't have anything to add. This is intentionally a really high level view for us to be thinking about where we have concentrated and prioritized our funding, and then also specifically around the re-engagement collaboratives, how we kind of envision or hope for YDO to grow in the supportive role, supporting grantees through these collaboratives and bringing folks together. And that what we have seen is some really important, successful outcomes when re-engagement and workforce development providers are in conversation, and the way that they can collaborate to better serve youth. So kind of raises the question of, should community investments be included in those collaboratives? Are those grants different enough that it makes sense for them to have some other support? So that's kind of, this is what we have now, and this is what we anticipate will work, and that is what the next slide takes us to the conversation about.
So that's where we want to, yeah, please,
jump in for a second.
Please.
I believe this is all being recorded, so I'm going to maybe add, just for the sake of the record. I think when you were talking about the future ready funding, what we anticipate in terms of the drop, and I now the exact phrase I don't recall, but I think I should just specify that our intention isn't necessarily to try to backfill a $7.5 million decrease in workforce grant making using other general fund dollars. I think the intention is to have a robust workforce grant, the size of which is still very much to be determined. We from conversations sort of understand that ultimately, with the end of the ARPA funds that were used for Future Ready, there's just not going to be that same scale of investment in any of the agencies that did Future Ready. So what we're thinking about is, in a post Future Ready landscape where we don't have that extra funding, how do we sort of prioritize workforce development within the scheme of our grants? So I just wanted to clarify that, so folks aren't wondering later on, like, why we don't have, a 7 or 10 or whatever $1 million workforce grant. We hope the scale is one that can support, to some extent, the level of need and demand that there is, but we just have to recognize that the resources are not going to be the same as they were in 2023, 25. So I just thought I would say that, on the tape here, just so that if someone's reviewing this, they do have that information.
Appreciate that, Cord. That's why we also want you on the call, on these calls, because you can help with that context. So thank you on that. So well, we want to open the conversation up, and actually I want to pause because it looks like we have another YDC member, Sam Coe, that joined. Do we have any others that joined, Melissa?
So far, it is just Sam. Welcome, Sam.
Sorry for being late. My other meeting went a little over.
Perfect. And Sam, if I can put you on the spot, because I think it's important to put out there for our conversation, we asked the other YDC members, I forgot the exact question. Let me go back to what that question is. I should have looked that before I spoke. What do you hope to get out of or contribute to this RFA planning work group? Oh, you're muted, Sam.
To contribute in any way I can, and for me, like for the for the grants, I just hope, like, for me, like, all the grants would tie into each other to go towards one certain thing. It's not like one grant is to do orange, and then one grant is to do green, one grant is to do blue, but then it's okay. But then as long as all the colors come together for an overall purpose, like same direction, that's what, because like YDO has so many different grants, like funding streams, but hopefully it'll all come, you know, and then you guys catch what I'm saying, right?
I think we do, Sam. I appreciate that of that connection. So actually, I should have talked to you because that was a good lead in to the discussion framework. So would like to hear from folks and also invite grant managers as it seems appropriate to just talk about your thoughts on the overarching youth grants framework. And as Sally said, that's a very high level piece. We'll get further into the specifics as we get deeper into it. But we want to kind of establish where we're headed, which I think after we add this conversation, you'll see where that connection is as we move forward. But so a couple questions on there is the overarching framework, your thoughts and reactions to that, things to consider, the creation of that separate RFA work group, or if you have questions within that, and then lastly that require re-engagement and workforce grantees connection to the collaborative grants. And also I think I failed to mention that that's what we have been doing this biennium as well. And so strengthening that and being much more specific into it, that's why we added that to the RFA framework that we're proposing. I'll stop talking for a minute and see if any of our council members have some thoughts or want to share some ideas.
Oh, I'd be happy to jump in.
Sorry, I forgot that we were supposed to call on you. I already forgot that. And that was one of the things that we wrote. So my bad.
That's okay. It's always hard with these meetings. I like the overarching framework. I think part of what's always been difficult for me as a youth development council member is to understand the coherence and connection across all of the different grant types. So I understand completely what Sam was trying to say. We are aiming for a target population, and the tools are slightly different, but we want to make it as easy for potential grantees to understand what we're trying to do and where they qualify as possible. So simplicity is better as long as we can do it with the funding strings, and keep the funding strings behind the curtain rather than sent up front and center. So I think I missed it when you were saying it before, but in the questions, it shows up. The intent at this point in time is to offer the workforce development funds separately, as a separate parallel RFA, just because we don't know what's happening in the legislature. Correct?
Correct. Yeah. And that was the idea. Yep.
But the intent would be that the process would be the same and the timing would be the same. It's just, it allows us more flexibility in terms of the amount of money we can put towards those grants.
Yes, well, and actually one of the things that I failed to mention with one of the reasons to separate those into three very distinct RFAs is we'll have a conversation later about what that timeline can look like in terms of release, but not having them all paired together can allow some flexibility. So we could do a tiered approach to releasing. So for example, we could release the community investments early and then wait until we see where the legislative process is and where those funding is with the work group. So having it separate allows for flexibility that we'll have further conversations as we get.
So 3 different RFAs. Okay. One for each bucket. Okay. That was not clear to me. That does make sense to me. And for me, re-engagement and workforce, the line there gets kind of blurry sometimes. But I recognize that we have funds for that re-engagement piece that are dedicated to that work. And then the collaboratives. I really like the approach that we started to take with regional convenings rather than asking for collaborative proposals. Collaborative proposals always sound great. I've been involved in them as both a applicant and grantee and as a funder at different organizations. But the convenings tend to be much more productive because there seems to be so much more mutual learning that occurs. And those almost serendipitous connections that evolve when people have similar objectives and discover that they can work together for greater outcome. And after they've received the funds, they're not feeling as competitive. But when it's in the grant application process, somehow the competition between the potential grantees in a collaborative grant causes a certain amount of tension, and that's not necessarily very functional.
I appreciate that, Zen. And I may have not been totally one of the things that we're proposing in that framework is that that is the re-engagement and workforce specific, because CI is a much broader, or community investment, excuse me, is much broader, and it may not as apply as directly as that connection with re-engagement and workforce. So just
my sense would be that if you were requiring participation in those regional collaboratives, that would be the case for re-engagement and workforce, but make it optional for community investment grantees, because again, there's overlap. There are organizations that participate across the spectrum, and they certainly have a lot to learn too.
Perfect.
Well, and this year we actually have required the community investment grantees that have workforce development grants to come to the convenings for precisely what you just said, Zan. And so I think that there's a little bit more for us to suss out, is like, what is the best way for us to be as inclusive as possible and not create undue burden on grantees to attend convenings. If they're running an after-school program for the youngest youth we serve, maybe that isn't as helpful. But when you speak to the idea of the organizations that serve this broad spectrum, then for them to be invited can be useful. And we've also talked like, what does it look like if we can also be a state agency that involves other folks, so systems of care and other kind of adjacent agencies or school districts that we know the grantees could benefit from being in conversation with. So there's more to be done there, I think, for us to continue to be a resource for our grantees.
All right. And being aware of time, I want to see if Sam or Janelle, and it looks like we have another guest too. So I'll come back to the guest that signed on, but Sam or Janelle, wanted to see if you had any comments or anything to share.
So Paul, I'm looking at slide 9, and thank you for placing the link of this PowerPoint, Melissa, in the chat. Okay, so community investments. What's the primary overarching thing that we want to see from community investments?
That's actually will want to be one of the topics as we move forward of that scope.
Okay.
Right now, it has 4 initiatives in it. It's primarily our broadest grants that function for youth development opportunities and access. And Abe might be able to speak a little bit better to the broad scope of where it is currently. But it is our broadest grant with kind of the most flexibility in terms of the programming that's in there. But I'll pause for a second and see if Abe,
Okay.
you want to add.
And then re-engagement is getting kids back into school, correct?
Correct.
So I think
workforce. Oh, sorry.
I was going to give a little bit of context. I think you're right. Kind of, it's those youth that are at risk of disengaging. I think that's a way of thinking it, or they may have older siblings who have disengaged. It's kind of getting in before they're in that riskiness. They have certain risk factors that may lead them to disengaging from school.
Okay.
That's the
and
way
workforce development is like career thingy, or to provide like paid internships or like jobs.
Sally, I'll let you take that one.
So right now, workforce development lives in 2 different places. One is within community investments, and that is a little broader. It includes career exploration all the way up through and including paid work experiences. Future Ready, which this year has $7.5 million, this biennium has $7.5 million of funding. What we're focusing on for all of those grantees is that they must provide services for 14 to 24-year-olds. So it's a limited age range, focusing on those who are already legal to have paid work. And they must have one of 3 core activities: paid work experiences, which is what most of them have; industry recognized credentialing, which we saw a little bit in the last biennium and have seen less of this time around, but that would be like for 18 to 24-year-olds, like if somebody got like a welding credential, that then they could get a job within that industry, is what we mean by industry recognized credentialing. And then the third is job placement and coaching, which is more in the direction of an internship that is kind of then promised a job afterward, and that there would be coaching along the way. So when we think about the spectrum of workforce development, currently our community investment grants are on the career exploration side, and then on the far other end of folks who are quite ready to work, there are some additional opportunities within Future Ready. So for the next biennium, we're looking at how can we be sure that the youth who are furthest from opportunity have the greatest chances to have their own personal development, including essential employability skills, right? Interview skills, resume writing skills, and that those youth then have opportunity for paid work that is reinforced and supported, and also includes wraparound supports that our other grants have always offered. Does that answer the question? I know I just kind of info dumped on you.
No. It's great. It's great. It's like now I'm kind of seeing, like, I'm looking at the slide, like re-engagement is keeping the kids engaged so they can gain employment, and community investments are helping to get, or workforce development is helping to, so the youth will acquire their skills and to acquire the jobs, and then, like, yeah, so the community investments, like when you pay them, yeah, so it goes step by step. That's how I'm kind of looking at it.
Yeah, and what we've seen
Thank
is
you.
that for youth, youth for whom finishing high school is difficult, it is also likely to be difficult for them to join the workforce. And so for them to have this ongoing support makes a lot of sense. And also what we have seen is that when youth who are involved in re-engagement programs also have career development opportunities offered to them, they realize, wow, if I'm able to finish this high school diploma or GED, that allows me to work toward getting that job I really want. And so enmeshing workforce development with our re-engagement efforts seems to increase the retention of youth within re-engagement efforts. So we want to ensure that workforce development stays tied to re-engagement, because we see how workforce development influences and supports youth finishing their credentials, and also creates for them a longer trajectory of what their future might look like. That if the end of the road is just that diploma, that can be much harder to push toward. And if the end of the road is in fact a career that looks really fun to them, then the diploma or GED is a stepping stone to get them where they're headed, looking very specifically at the development of each individual youth and focusing on what does this youth need and want in order to be successful and have a prosperous future.
And I think one of the things I'd add to that, Sally, is what we took from our first convening of this biennium is the more we can connect that to the youth furthest from opportunity, all of the other supports are strengthened to those youth that may just be in community investments and transition and complete high school and then transition into workforce development. So those partnerships strengthen the overall system by focusing on the youth furthest from opportunity within that. Court, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then I just time check that we'll move on to the next topic here in just a moment.
Oh, sure. I missed it. We didn't give Fallon a chance to.
Oh, thank you.
Let's say hello, did we?
We did not.
I'll pause for that.
I just saw Fallon's introduction in the chat. Thank you.
Nice. All right, thank you. Welcome, Fallon. Thanks for joining us. I was just going to add, there's another angle to separating workforce from community investments, and it's kind of around accountability and reporting. So one of the goals that I think will get discussed over the course of the work group is trying to be more proactive in helping applicants to understand the expectations around reporting for their respective grants. We've always honestly struggled with that, and we just don't have a lot of it tends to be a race to get reporting developed and to roll that out. And I think particularly around workforce, there are different things we want to measure than we might want to look at for a community investment grant, say serving elementary school youth. One of our challenges has been that if every grant is measuring, did the outcome at the end of the program, did you graduate from high school? That's not relevant for a lot of our programs that are serving youth who are not of the age or grade level to graduate. The graduation rate for an 8th grade program is not actually helpful to know. So what we can do if we build workforce out as a discrete grant program is build reporting that is really specific to workforce development. And when it comes to reporting out to the legislature, council, or whoever down the line, we're able to actually talk about the number of youth served by workforce programs, and of those youth, the number that have jobs, who graduate, who are also connected to a re-engagement program, et cetera. So I think that it also gives us a way of starting to tell a more focused story about what we're doing in workforce development. And ideally, the folks who want to do workforce related programming are guided to apply for that grant. So they're giving us that data. We've also had the challenge of, with community investments being a bit broad, that there's programs that are really workforce programs that don't show up in our workforce portfolio. So it is kind of, I think there's an intentionality also about how this allows us to better, deliver accountability for this and tell the story of workforce programming that we're doing.
Thank you, Cord. Before moving on, just want to check if any of the grant managers or Janelle, you have something to add to the framework. I think that discussion is invaluable for us as staff that are building these RFAs, so appreciate the discussion as well. All right, so we're going to go ahead and Melissa, if you can pull up the next slide, would be great. We're going to talk a little bit more about meeting logistics and kind of topics. And I just want to note too that apologize to Fallon for not getting there, but they've signed off for this meeting. Will join us in another time, which is a great lead into this. What we've done for this work group is we have published the upcoming RFA work group meetings purposely to try to engage folks at a multitude. So you can notice that we do have some movement in terms of time frame, typically in the middle part of the day, but also in terms of days of the week to try to have folks join us at different times. Our intent with this work group is that you don't have to attend everyone. We welcome and encourage folks to join absolutely as many as they can, but to try to strategically have meetings throughout the course of the next few months to talk about key topics along the way, which then we'll move to the next. And also to note, October and November dates are kind of on pause right now. We have a couple other pretty major planning events that we're working around, including the YDC possible retreat, as well as our upcoming fall 2024 convening dates. So we want to make sure that we coordinate that appropriately once those activities get set. So those will be added at a later time for it. So the next slide, it shows the topics that we anticipate seeing. And again, this is draft order, but wanted to have folks be able to know what's kind of upcoming. So you can see in June, we covered the workforce structure, work group structure and the youth grants overview today, and that's kind of the only meeting we have scheduled for June. We move into July, we're going to start talking about the individual RFA scopes, and we anticipate starting with our re-engagement scope of the grant. So that's the core activities and this core content of what those grants look like within it. So we anticipate starting with the re-engagement, moving into the community investment, which will then move us towards the workforce. Sorry, I'm getting my compound words there mixed up. So the workforce RFA scopes along the way, and then grant specific requirements. So talking in detail what that looks like. So for example, we'll talk about what eligible youth look like in the re-engagement scope as well on that. Moving into August, you'll notice they kind of build on each other. So August is that timing and release once we know the scopes, as well as funding limitations and eligibility requirements within that. So those are some important conversations that we want to input on as well. Moving into September, which then is that evaluation and rubric process, or the kind of what I would say more into the weeds of the actual process of how things are done. And then October is kind of a summary of that. November then focuses on moving to that YDC approval process in December. So again, very broad categories on that. So we'll bump it to the next slide. And Sam, I appreciated you pointing out that we put the PDF in there because it's hard to include this information, then move to questions. So yeah, if you have that, that kind of helps you to bounce back. But do want some thoughts around the work group topics and structure that we've presented throughout this meeting. If there's things that you feel like you want us to hear or things that we should consider. The other piece there that you see invited participants, we did not specifically reach out to invited participants around that. But if as a work group we feel they're specific, we're going to, as a team, as a YDO team or team as well, discuss who we should invite for specific conversations. So when we specifically, for example, when we start talking about application limits and funding limitations around that, we have some grantees that receive quite a few of our grant funds, and we want to hear from them as well as some others that may be impacted by having those there. So we want some rich dialogue in that. So are there some folks that you think should be invited to either the specific topic or in general to this group? And then also kind of who is here, who is not here that we should seek out? And that would be work that we do between these meetings. So I'll pause again and turn it over to our council members for thoughts, as well as anybody else that I might have missed in that quick recap. I'm looking for hands, but also I would say since there's 3 council members, you can probably unmute as well. So I did learn from the first time, Zan, that you followed the process, and I failed to do that. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, with only 3 of us council members here, that makes it a little easier just to speak. I can't think of anyone that really should be here right at this moment, but I'll ponder that, and I'm happy to send you and Sally any suggestions that I come up with. I think as we move into the second and third meetings, it'll pick up steam, and we will we'll gain people. Sam just put a name in the chat.
Oh, perfect. Sorry. Sam, thank you. So Sam, just for to put it into the space, we have ODE, CTE person, and possibly somebody from HEC in terms of those conversations. Obviously, we work closely with both of those agencies along that, so appreciate that suggestion as well.
Yeah, and I'm gonna think like Cord for a minute and think about who we may want to engage, particularly along the workforce line of grants, in order to have as broad as possible an alliance going into the legislative session for funding.
Very important. And I also forgot to mention, so Melissa is going to be our admin that is helping coordinate and sharing all the information. So any council members that need information can definitely reach out to Sally and I as we're the facilitators of the group, but Melissa is our admin that support for this work group. So I apologize. Realize that we did not say that at the beginning.
Zan, I'll share this just for the sake of kind of where things are at now in terms of that conversation. You know, we have talked a bit with HEC, we've talked a bit with the governor's office. What we are hearing right now is that there's not going to be an investment at the level of 23-25 future ready, which is, you know, not totally surprising. In terms of a multi-agency effort, that also doesn't seem to be on the table. That there's sort of that was probably a product of there being such a bit of, you know, you know, an abundance of riches briefly, and that, you know, in that particular moment, that was the way they wanted to approach it, but kind of moving into maybe a little more of a scarcity environment, you know, that isn't something that we're seeing a lot of interest in. That said, you know, we're still continuing to talk about, you know, what the Future Ready Youth programs have done, and trying to just sort of highlight how these are a unique part of Future Ready. You know, we'll be reporting out to the legislature. We're really trying to make sure that we are effectively telling the story, and, you know, just really demonstrating how our particular part of the investment was something unique and impactful. But that said, I mean, I think it's still a great thing to get folks from HEC into the conversation. I think even if we are not working together, you know, on, you know, in terms of funding, you know, or something within the next legislative session, we still ought to be working together in terms of coordination and alignment. Ultimately, before Future Ready was on the table, we were starting that conversation of how do we best complement each other in our work. And we've had some conversations recently about, how what we do around workforce. There's a lot of, I think, complementary qualities. I mean, there are things that we do that are very similar, but I think that the focus and the why of our programs are a bit different. And I think one of the things that we think is maybe a valuable distinction is that for HEC workforce programs broadly, not just youth, but HEC in general, it is ultimately driven by the need to train a workforce. It is employer focused, it is workforce focused, and our work is always going to be youth focused. And those don't have to be, they're not mutually exclusive. But I think that talking about what we do from the perspective of a youth first approach to training, to stabilization, so that someone can engage in training and can move into the workforce, might just be like the unique part of the unique value proposition that we would bring. So it's not so much, it's not that we're sort of having to go it alone. I think it's sort of contending with the reality of a bit of a little bit of the hangover of having had a lot of funding for this. But now that times are leaner, it's an opportunity to say, okay, like, how do we really focus? And how do we do things that are unique? One last thing that I'll share is that one thing we've been thinking a little bit about is how our programs might serve some of the priority populations and some populations that weren't named in Future Ready, particularly youth experiencing homelessness. Governor has a priority around housing and homelessness. And, I'm working on trying to sort of like just make sure folks remember us in that context. The DHS Youth Experiencing Homelessness programs did workforce grants for a while, and they, at least as of 2023, were sending folks to us for those resources. And up till now, we haven't had workforce funding that focused on youth experiencing homelessness, but that could be a place where we would maybe do something unique that no other agency is currently doing. So, it is, I think that getting folks to the table to talk about how we align is really important. But we're also in this position of having to really demonstrate the unique thing that we're going to bring to this scope of work. So I feel like that's the latest, like that's really where we're at with the thinking now. And I figure that's good to put out just for folks to have it transparently.
I appreciate that, Cord. Also, to add some context, with youth experiencing homelessness, we've seen good success within our re-engagement programs, and so it's not a area that we're not currently in, and so the more that we can expand that and provide that opportunity, because there's some youth that are impacted by this work greatly, and in some very positive ways. So hopefully we can keep focused on that. All right, a couple of things that I thought of as maybe others are thinking of. So invited participants, just to be kind of clear on what that piece is, those will be some invited participants will be folks that come that are directly invited from Sally, myself, or Melissa in terms of our work. And we do that so that we can make sure that we prioritize those conversations and the discussions, right? Because they bring a specific level of interest and expertise in the area that we might be talking that day. And so if there are folks that you want us to specifically invite, that would be something to please connect with Melissa, Sally, and I on, and we'll get those invites out. Also encourage you to invite other people to come and just be a part of it. The intent of this work group isn't to limit conversations around other guests and folks, but just to make sure that we allow those dialogues and honor the people that we know want to be a part of that conversation, and then also our guests along the way as time permits. It's an interesting meeting to plan for when we don't know exactly how many people are, and I appreciate, Zan, that hopefully this does gain steam along the way. I know I'm taking a lot from this conversation, so I appreciate the dialogue, even though we have just 3 of our council members here. A lot more specific than we're able to do in a council meeting, which I greatly appreciate on that. So other thoughts or questions? Again, open it up to council members as well as our YDO staff as we're a little bit slightly ahead of schedule, which is, I guess, not anticipated. I think this is a good time check for us as well on that. All righty. I'm judging the silence as either people thinking or ready for us to go ahead and call it for this meeting. So Melissa and Cord, since this is my first work group meeting, I've helped facilitate. You're gonna have to tell me how we end because this is different.
I will offer my opinion, and then Melissa, you can check me on this. But I believe since this isn't, I mean, there is a time-based agenda, but it's not quite the same as a council meeting or committee meeting. I don't believe there's public comment specified because our intention is that if we have grantees or non-grantees who come, we want to find ways to engage them. So given there's no expected thing to happen, I think it's okay if you adjourn early. But Melissa,
Okay.
you can confirm or
That
correct.
is absolutely correct. There's no public comment. We've had discussion throughout. And one thing I'll note for everyone who is here, we're using the same Zoom link. So if you note today's meeting will be the same link as all of the rest of them. And I was just gonna put the last slide up since you have it.
Oh, thank you. Yes, that would be
And
good.
there we go.
And Melissa, correct me if I'm wrong, but you are sending out invites to all council members for each of these meetings, or have you already? Or I don't remember how that goes. Do you mind clarifying how that went?
Yep, I will be doing that. Wait, yes, I'm I have to keep checking if I'm muted or not today. I will be doing that. I wanted to sort of get this one done and find out if there were stakeholders that we'd be inviting to future meetings, but I can send the rest of them out probably today or by Monday for sure.
Awesome. And
And
just for the record,
Paul-
it is totally fine to accept it as tentative, knowing that you, our council members are busy, but right, that we hope to have you there. And so accepting it tentative so it's on your calendar is totally recognizable. I'll speak for Melissa on that. Sorry, hopefully I didn't speak. Court.
Paul, do you mind just quickly, like, just doing a quick 20 seconds on what what you plan to discuss in the next meeting and any kind of highlights or information folks might think about?
Absolutely. So right now, the next meeting is looking to be focused around our re-engagement scope and the requirements around that. And so that one, part of the reason we're starting on that one is there's a lot of legislative requirements based onto that and administrative rules, and probably have some of maybe the least amount of changes that we anticipate. But there are some key topics that we want to talk about what that looks like as we move forward in that work, and then that later in July, I anticipate it moving towards some of the initiatives specifically with NCI, possibly in that next meeting as well, around our youth gangs and violence prevention work, and then moving into the promise and solution initiatives. Again, trying to not use the names of those initiatives because we don't know if that will be what it remains, but the conversation around the scope of that work. Thanks, Cord, for asking that. And Molly, let me know if I missed anything, because I know you and I have talked about the next meeting a little bit. So.
That sounds good.
All right.
Thank you.
Awesome. I see it, Molly, head nod. Thank you. It's a good cue. I can see everybody on screen. That's a nice part about this small meeting. See everybody. All right. Any last questions or thoughts that people want to share? Just greatly appreciate things. Greatly appreciate the grant managers being a part of this conversation as well. I think it's important as we continue to move this work forward. It is always a big lift for our agency, and really appreciate the input and insight and discussion that everybody's providing. Do I officially say adjourn, or how does that work? Again, okay, cool.
Informal.
Just
See you
checking.
on the 16th
All right.
of July, if not before.
See y'all on the 16th. Sounds good. Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.